So let's talk through a few of the units in Warhammer 40k that gained the most from the last balance update. What are they, why are they important for their faction, and how much did they improve? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where for this one I thought we'd focus on some of the individual units that won the most out of the balance update. Rather than looking at entire armies, just some individual datasheets that look like they're going to be far more relevant for their factions. For this one, mostly due to points changes, as the rules changes that they did were at least kind of limited. For the majority of units that got buffed, I feel like Games Workshop largely targeted things that weren't particularly strong before and made them more sort of usable options for their army as opposed to outright strong. That kind of makes sense given that the vast majority of factions in Warhammer 40k were at least relatively well balanced against each other. Though with a few notable exceptions like Space Marines and Imperial Agents, there's still quite a lot of stuff that really became kind of standout with the points update though, and for this video I thought we'd talk through 9 of them, and then talk through a bunch of the rest in Honourable Mentions. Jumping straight in, and I feel like one of the biggest surprise winners of the update were the Deathshroud Terminators, maybe to the point of wondering whether or not Games Workshop buffed the wrong datasheet here. Pre-update there were 120 points per 3 of them, now there are 110. And I already would have considered them a pretty top tier unit for Death Guard, running lots of competitive lists and loads of good things going for them. It was both surprising they got a points cut, and it was also 10 points, not 5. Each Deathshroud Terminator is really quite tanky, 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 2+ save, 4+ invulnerable save, and -1 to wound if they're with a character. With the toughness and -1 to wound, that gives them some advantages against a bunch of Terminators, never mind the fact that they cost about the same price as most. Their melee is fairly standout scary compared with other Terminators for the cost. 4 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 with lethal hits is a pretty fantastically general purpose profile. You're still going to get plenty of wounds against things that they're wounding on a 5+, and with Contagions of Nurgle, enemies are going to be -1 toughness and also often have that armor debuffed by 1 pip as well. You can maybe get sustained hits 1 or even sustained hits 2 via a stratagem if you can use it on an effective objective marker, and can flex into a sweep mode if they just need to absolutely obliterate some horde units. They've got a great leader choice, and it's kind of mad that 3 of these plus Typhus is now only 190 points. The Sorcerer and the Lords are all strong though. Really their only major downside is their very slow movement of 4 inches. But even with that, I feel like for 110 points, just moving them straight up the board towards a midfield objective is going to guarantee that they cause problems, though my preferred way to get them there would be to deep strike them, likely via rapid ingress if you have a good opportunity to. They're tough enough that they could drop plenty of places that the enemy could shoot them, not take too many casualties, and then get a very short charge next turn. Overall, they were just strong before, and now they're absolutely great. It was very weird that they got the buff and the Blight Lords didn't, given that these are the ones that everyone tends to play a lot more, given that they're just so much more dangerous that it's easily worth the extra points per model. Definitely feels like they should have got the decrease of the 2. It's not really like Death Guard particularly needed just a general power boost either. They were fairly mid-tier and better balanced versus the other factions of 40k than plenty of other armies out there. Next up, for another very good unit that got better as well, we've got the Astra Militarum Scout Sentinel. They're 55 points each now rather than 60. Again, just all round surprising that they get a points cut, given that you could pretty much always include Scout Sentinels in a guard list. At least 1 or 2 of them would basically never be a wrong choice, and you could totally run more if you wanted to. 7 wounds at toughness 7 with a 3+ save is massive toughness for 60 points, and even more so for 55. Lots of normal sized squads are going to struggle to take that down. They can move really quite fast for guard with a 10-inch movement and a 9-inch scout. They're quite a nice choice for just towing on to midfield objective markers nice and early. As mentioned, more irritating than they should be to destroy for their points cost, and also a nice cheap expendable unit. They often tend to run with a las cannon and hunter killer missile, which means that enemy tanks and things certainly can't discount them as a threat, and they get lethal hits against everything now, which is a nice bonus. Plus some melee that does chip away at things a little bit in close combat. 3 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1 will grind a few infantry down if they wind up in a prolonged combat. Then on top of all that, which takes them to the real next level, is that they can mark a unit for a shooting buff. You guard units get to reroll 1s to hit against something that was marked, which is a genuinely good damage buff when it could apply to several other units focusing fire on one thing. Particularly so for on a 55 point of otherwise usable unit at least. And they can occasionally buff barrage things as well. You could ignore the -1 to hit penalty for things like mortars and field ordnance batteries. The basilisks and things won't care so much given that they're capped at hitting on a 4+ now anyway. Finally, they've got both the squadron and the regiment keywords, which means they've got great access to orders. It's not always going to make sense to target orders at them particularly, but occasionally move might be the thing that they need to do to get to an objective. They could even be a good target for the reinforcement stratagem by recycling a unit of 3 of them if you wanted to get a fair amount of points back from that. Overall they were great before, no idea at all why they got a 5-point buff. Feels like having one or two of them are pretty near auto-include status, and you certainly could go more. Before we move on, I'd just like to give a shout out to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold. One option out there to get some magnetic carry cases to get your models from A to B in safety. They're a US based company, links down in the video description, though they ship free to a whole bunch of locations around the world. And as magnetic carry cases, the idea is that you put the magnets on the bottom of your model's bases and then they attach to a bunch of steel trays in here, which immobilises them and stops them sliding around in transport, so you can basically have them all set up like this and transport a lot of miniatures in a small volume without them rubbing on each other. The Tabletop Stronghold cases are made of sturdy MDF, and then they have a bunch of steel trays that slot in at different sort of levels. They do require a little bit of assembly to put together, and are a little weightier than some other options out there due to the MDF construction, but it does mean that they are unusually robust and harder to damage than most. One quite fun thing is they have an acrylic sheet on the front, so basically clear plastic pretty much, so you can see or display your models while they're stored, which is an advantage over a few other things. And broadly speaking, people who I've heard from tend to have got on quite well with these. Reviews and reports on Reddit and things that seem really quite positive. There's plenty of other options out there, of course, including making your own DIY, but I think they could be the right choice for plenty of people. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Check them out linked in the video description, and I'll cycle back to talk through their range at the end of the video. Getting back to the much improved units of Warhammer 40k though, next up we have the Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium, Roboute Guilliman. He got one of the single most spectacular points cuts out of the entirety of the update, dropping all the way down from 350 to 285. Something of this sort of nature was needed though, I think. He was basically unused competitively prior to that in Ultramarines list, just not doing quite enough to justify himself, and competed poorly with their other options. I actually expect for a big central character, he's pretty tough with 10 wounds at toughness 9 with a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable, and the lone operative protection that he gets if he can stay near infantry. Occasionally that can be good for some very big shenanigans, units hidden behind terrain, or working with a combi lieutenant. He also gets a chance to revive on death on a 3+, which can often put the opponent off expending all the resources that it needs to kill him, coming back with 6 wounds remaining more times than not. In melee, like the other Primarchs, he's massively dangerous, 7 attacks at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 4 with lethal hits for the big profile, or the Emperor's Sword sweeps for a pretty perfect Space Marine killing profile, plus a little shooting from the Hand of Dominion. Then his 2 primary buffs are either an aura of reduced cost command points, sort of captain style, and that's quite a big deal when it can affect all manner of different units within range. You could use that to do Overwatch on big tanks or Land Raider Redeemers for example, or heroic intervene with the exact thing necessary, and otherwise you can just plug it into extra damage, selecting a second target for Oath of Moment after you've slain your first one. Both of those are really quite big force multipliers. I feel like that's far more justifiable between his damage and defense being tricky to kill and those buffs. My guess is that we'll see a fair few more competitive lists experimenting with him, even if core Codex Space Marines are still waiting on some help till the Christmas update. I wonder whether this points cut will be enough to see him competing with Calgar and Uriel Ventris, who often tend to tag team as the characters of choice in Ultramarines lists. Next up we've got the great big orky squig drawn contraption that is the Kill Rig. Previously these were 170 points, now they're 155, a big almost 10% cut there. Before I would have rated them as a solidly usable unit for the Orcs, though one amongst many usable units as opposed to a standout one. I feel that this one will be enough to make them truly stand out and a lot of lists to take them. Its durability has got 16 wounds at toughness 10 with a 3+ save and a 6+ feel no pain, which is just standout tanky for 155 points. Comparing it to most of the other factions' main battle tanks, generally has it come off very favourably. It's OC5 on objectives as well and moves at least somewhat fast. It's quite likely to be transporting 10 beast snaggers and a beast boss into the fight, and then they can jump out to secure objectives and have some good damage output against basically whatever you charge, from tough stuff to lighter infantry. The beast snagger boys dropping by 10 points definitely helped the entire proposal as well. Then for its damage you get D3 torrent kind of las cannon style shots at 24 inches, unusually reliable for orc shooting there, and Overwatch is really quite nice with that. Not many factions can Overwatch with really quite a good chance to deal some solid damage to tanks and vehicles, and that can be really big if you can finish something off. You then have the bonus indirect fire and the sticker cannon, which I treat as an extra as opposed to reliably doing anything, and then solid sort of skirmish melee with a mix of 3 generalist profiles. Should scrape a few wounds off tough stuff, but be quite threatening and cause some big damage to some medium infantry. As if that weren't enough, it's also got a +1 strength and melee buff for a unit within 12 inches, not always relevant, but sometimes it could translate to +1 to wound, which is good. For 155 points for these things, it just seems really quite hard to go too far wrong with. You're going to have 3 big tanky things that the opponent is going to need to deal with, otherwise they're just going to cause annoying damage every turn. And great utility between the good Overwatch and the transport things. I feel like they're still probably going to be best in War Horde as opposed to the Big Hunt, just due to the detachment rule and its limitations. Sustained hits on all those melee profiles is definitely no bad thing for the kill rig though. Next up, for the Blood Angels new Codex points, I feel like perhaps the biggest winners were perhaps the Sanguinary Guard and Mephiston. I thought I'd focus on the Lord of Death for this one. Mephiston is the Chief Librarian of the Blood Angels. He's 125 points, which was an increase of 25 points from his previous one, but given the changes in the Codex, I think that's more than fair enough. He got reinterpreted to basically being a bit like the Sanguinor, but a bit different now. Another fairly fast, very threatening lone operative with fights first. On the defensive, he's maybe unusually tanky for a lone operative. 6 wounds at toughness 5 with a 2+ save and 4+ feel no pain. So you're averaging needing to do around 12 wounds to that profile to bring him down, and that'll go very well with Armour of Contempt, and it does have an invulnerable these days as well. He's then got 7-inch move with inbuilt advance and charge, should hopefully be able to get him to skirmish over some objectives and things. A little bit of genuine shooting threat between Fury of the Ancients and a plasma pistol. Fairly solid and general purpose melee, with 6 attacks at strength 9, AP 3 and damage D3 with Veteris. If you're on the charge in the Liberator group, that'd be 7 attacks at strength 11 at that profile, which is a lot more scary against enemy tough stuff. And then finally, as if that weren't all enough, there's the chance to lock enemies in melee if they fail a leadership test when falling back. As lone operatives go, he's just kind of spectacular value in Warhammer 40k right now. They're generally handy enough to have just for utility purposes. You know, your opponent can't interact with them, so they could be safe screening places or doing objectives and things and can't just be gunned down at long range. And then of course, if they do get anywhere near too close, he can immediately jump on them with a whole bunch of damage if he wants to. Overall, I'd expect to see him appearing in really quite a lot of Blood Angels lists for a while now. Next up, we're back to the Death Guard with Mortarion, Demon Primarch of Nurgle. He dropped down from 325 points down to 300. Before the update, I would have classed him as usable enough and a nice tanky unit to have in the midst of a Death Guard army list, though the majority of competitive lists that I saw tended not to bother with him and bring other things, even if plenty also did choose to bring him along. Now they're at 300 though, I feel like he's going to be present in a lot more armies. He already had standout good durability, 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save and a 5+ feel no pain. It's just incredibly hard to put down. Pretty much nothing's going to be particularly efficient at killing him. His damage certainly isn't anywhere near as standout, though he's still going to be well capable of soloing most medium-sized units on his own. He's got 5 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage 4 in melee, which will be amped up by Contagions of Nurgle a little bit. He's got access to a sweep mode, plus Rot Wind and the Lantern shooting, which will add a bit. I think that kind of damage is still intimidating though, just because there's a good chance that the opponent will sink a load of firepower into him and not kill him, and then he can be around to attack something back. Beyond that, he's got an Ignores Modifier aura, which is good against some enemies, but a bit more relevant in some games than others, and then either an Aura of Cover or reroll wound rolls of 1, depending on what's more useful on that turn, or he can do a boost to your Contagions of Nurgle range. At 300 points, I feel like a fair few more Death Guard players will be putting their Primarch back on the table. You could potentially hide him for a turn if you want to, and then just push him up towards the midfield objectives, maybe acting a bit like the Ultimate Distraction Carnifex, loads of durability, and if the opponent doesn't deal with him, he will start killing things, but they'd have to make some tough choices as to whether they go after him or other units in the army. It certainly doesn't feel like quite as much a disaster as, say, if you lose Magnus for the Thousand Suns, given that this guy costs 300 points and not over 450. Next up, we've got the great big energy weapon of the Doomsday Ark. Already very scary Necron firepower that really didn't need a buff, but still got one for some reason. Recent successful Hypercrypt lists tended to often be spamming these. The majority of top placing ones over the past couple of months were using 2 or 3 of the things. It gets on quite well with that detachment because it can essentially warp around the board and pretty well always know that it's going to get line of sight, just turning up on the flanks and then blasting something away if its on the board position isn't acceptable enough. In any case, it dropped down from 200 points to 190, so not an enormous boost, but still an already top tier unit getting yet further ahead of a bunch of the rest of the pack. Its Doomsday Cannon gets you D6 plus 1 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 4, a weapon that can one-shot enemy tanks when it rolls well, though it's still a little bit on the unreliable side, far less so than in 9th edition. If it's stationary, it both gets the heavy keyword to hit on a 2+ and devastating wounds as well, both of which could be helpful, but often you will need to move in 10th edition realistically. On the defensive, it's absolutely fine. 14 wounds at toughness 9 with a 4+ invulnerable save is solid enough. If it's deployed somewhere towards the back of the force and well screened, the majority of things that might be hitting it could be long-range, single-shot anti-tank weapons, things that might have punctured good armor saves anyway, so it's more helpful to have the 4+ invulnerable. And given the invulnerable save and loads of wounds, there's a pretty reasonable chance it survives to do a bit of reanimation, unless the opponent gets lucky or can really focus it down. Otherwise, objective control 5 isn't bad at all for a tank camping near a home field objective, and just in case there were any interlopers into the backfield, you can suddenly just light them up with a whole bunch of Gauss shots. 20 lethal hit strength 4 shots within 12 inches is no laughing matter, and it could easily murderize a bunch of light infantry if it needed to. Particularly with the heavy destroyer nerf, that basically cements this as the way to go for Necron anti-tank firepower needs. And with this thing going down and the Doomstalker going up, it's even getting to the point where it might well outshoot the Doomstalkers in Canoptek Court Legion, never mind other places. Next up, we've got the Tau Empire, or rather their Kroot allies, where another one of the more generous points cuts of the update fell on the Krootox Rampagers. They dropped from 110 points down to 95, so a big 14% decrease there, and a pretty huge boost to their efficiency. Previously, they just weren't really being taken in competitive lists, aside from a few people trying to make the Kroot detachment work. I feel like at 95 points there's a good chance that we see a fair few more of them. These guys are now basically 32 points per model. For that you get 5 wounds at toughness 6 with a 5+ save. It is a profile that the vast majority of things will damage it quite well, everything from small arms to anti-tank, but you still need really quite a lot of volume fire almost regardless of what you're firing at it. Las cannons might not necessarily kill one. Small arms will need a whole ton of wounds that'll be on a 5+ or worse, given it's under 100 points for 15 wounds. They're way better in Kroot Hunting Pack as well, with a 5+ invulnerable save against enemy ranged attacks. And certainly for a bunch of melee units out there, they're a pretty chunky unit that they might have a hard sort of time charging, just in case they roll kind of low and wind up just getting hit back by a whole bunch of volume. These guys have got enough attacks to absolutely obliterate enemy infantry, and hopefully stack some saves on tougher stuff. They've got 3 attacks with Lance at strength 4, AP 1 and damage 1, and then 4 attacks with sustained hits at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2, so 42 attacks there for a unit of 6 of them. Plus each one that makes it into engagement range on the charge has the chance to deal D3 mortal wounds as well, which helps them out against the targets that their sort of middling strength and low AP might struggle against. They've got Scout 7 inches, so potentially could take up a good position in the midfield, maybe behind a ruin or something, and make the opponent seriously think about whether or not they want to get any closer to them. I'd say the main downside overall is that they might struggle against some tougher targets, and also their 7-inch move plus the mounted keyword is a bit of a downside. It means they might struggle to get the charge on the enemy as opposed to the other way around, and might be tanky a bit of firepower. I don't know if they'll necessarily see that much play in more standard Tau lists, but they absolutely look like they'll be a pretty massive staple in the Kroot Hunting Pack at that cost. The 5+ invulnerable save really makes them on the next level, I think, and they also have that stratagem that means that for 1 command point they won't be able to be shot at longer range, which seems really impactful on a big 6 unit. Finally, for the main units I wanted to focus on, I thought I mentioned Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels. It does seem to have been a far better update for 3 of the Primarchs than the other 2. Like Guilliman, he's also down to 285 points. Previously, I would have rated him as okay but not crazy standout for the Dark Angels. He was being used in some competitive lists though, and Dark Angels themselves have generally been pretty strong, so maybe a good sign that he was already making the cut for some people. He moves 8 inches and can ghost through ruined walls now as per the last update, same as Guilliman. He's got the same sturdy profile with toughness 9 and 10 wounds, but a 3+ invulnerable save from the Emperor's Shield, even if he doesn't get the revive on death thing, plus the lone operative protection. His melee is very scary and general purpose, not so very different to Guilliman's, a little bit better against certain targets and worse against others, but the big thing that he gets is the fights first special rule, which just makes him a really big problem unit for a whole load of armies that want to try and deal with him. Big heavy firepower won't be able to shoot him outside of 12 inches away, provided he can tag team with some infantry. If you venture within 12 inches, then there's a good chance you're getting charged by him anyway, and if you charge him, he'll get to hit you with that scary melee profile first. Now, Heroic Intervention is 1 command point as well, that makes fights first units like him even scarier. His buffs are nowhere near quite as good as Guilliman's, though still useful. Probably the most interesting one is the one that allows him to increase the cost of enemy stratagems within 12 inches, plus having the bonus rule that you also might just flat out deny them if they fail a battle shock. That's certainly not too bad to have on a frontline unit. Otherwise, if there's mortal wounds around or devastating wounds, you can have a 4+ save against those, or an aura of +1 to hit in melee, which I think is maybe a little bit of a clunkier one. I guess occasionally that might make sense for inner circle companions perhaps. Overall, I think the change has probably been enough to take him from being usable but at a big investment to feeling a bit better about him. With the update, he'll certainly gained relative to the Deathwing Knights, where he's now not so very much more than a full squad of them now, and might have a better chance of making the cut. Fire Discipline and Repulsors got hit a little bit as well. I wonder if some Dark Angels might be re-embracing a bit of Plasma with some Hellblasters on that front. Otherwise though, beyond those ones, there's a whole ton of units that were worth a mention. The Biologist Putrefy for the Death Guard was already a top tier competitive unit that dropped in points for no good reason. The Death Guard changes were kind of odd, and Typhus I feel like kind of won just by staying put. The Sanguinary Guard have a nasty points cost at 135. I wouldn't have been surprised if they had been 140 or 145, so that's good for them. Beast of Nurgle at 65 points are nicely disruptive. Shalaxi Hellbane is a much better rival for the other greater demons. The Wardog Brigand is 165 down from 170, very relevant for Chaos Knight lists given that their cookie cutter list was often a massive amount of carnivores and brigands, so that's going to be a fairly direct strength increase for them, even if the other points costs aren't enough to have the big knights catch up with the Wardogs still. Both flavours of Grey Knight Terminators were already very solid, so getting points cuts on their smaller units is fine there. The Eldari Grav Tanks, the Falcon, Wave Serpent and Fire Prism were all fine before and better now. Genestealer Cult got loads of points cuts. Maybe the ones to their battle line units feel like some of the best ones. They're just relevant in a whole load of army lists and for some combos, plus just being quite nice scoring units anyway. Boys and Beastnagger Boys dropping for the Orcs is again going to be relevant to loads of lists as the core troops choice. They can be quite solid jumping out of trucks, and Orc war bosses that join them didn't get a points increase, but the +4 tax triggering when you're inside a transport, that's a big win for one of the Orc's strongest datasheets that probably never should have been ruled against that way in the first place. Back to the Tau and Commander Farsight at 95 points seems like a hard one to pass up for Retaliation Cadre now, particularly given that he can make that close drop stratagem a lot more acceptably costed, and recruit carnivores to access sticky objectives for fairly cheap is another helpful boost. Out of the Chaos Space Marines, Vashtor and Abaddon I felt like got some interesting decreases, and for the Imperial Guard, the Ogrins at 60 points are genuinely looking like a fair force to be reckoned with, and the Tank Commander, despite a points increase, I think is looking more interesting if anything now. Being able to self-order is a really big deal, as is gaining the Squadron keyword for lethal hits on multi-melters and things. They're very expensive, but they're very, very deadly, and very independent for the cost now. Overall, plenty of things that improved in Warhammer 40k, even if there were a whole bunch of nerfs. Let me know what you'd rate as some of the most improved units that you're thinking about putting on the tabletop a bit more after the points changes. Finally for this one, I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold. One option to transport your model armies, mounting magnets on the bases of infantry and vehicles so they can be attached to a steel carry tray and be transported nice and safely. Those steel trays can slot in at different levels, as you can see on the left there. There's a bunch of MDF levels so you can raise and lower them so you'd have different room for different size miniatures. And then here's a rough example of how many you can get on one of the trays, something like around about 30 odd Terminators or 98 infantry. You might not want to load them quite this full, but maybe gives a rough idea as to the amount of things that you could fit in if you needed. Then mag cases come in three main sizes. The first one is this mag case mini, £84, $100 or €101. And if you've seen this video early, then you can use the code TACTICS for 20% off until the 23rd of October. This one's maybe a bit more aimed at sort of skirmish sized armies, perhaps combat patrols and things, but even this one's big enough for some hefty stuff. You can see a Land Raider and Sakaran tank on the bottom, and a whole bunch of Terminators on the top. This is the more standard size army offering for the regular mag case, £140, $165 or €166, again 20% off with that code. This one's pretty tall and has room for a bunch of levels. You can see a Chaos Knight on the bottom one for example, and I'll leave the internal and external dimensions here on the screen. Shipping is free to a whole bunch of places around the world from the USA. They go to the UK, Canada, EU and Australia and New Zealand. Then this one's the really big one, the Magcase XL, essentially two of the previous ones stuck together. This one's £277, $330 or €330. They all come with magnets to attach to the miniature bases included as well, a whole bunch of 3x2 ones. And you can see the acrylic clear screen on the front here that's attached with those clips. There is a cheaper version of this one available as well with a few less steel trays. It depends on the sort of amount of levels that you need, but this one should be able to do a pretty big Warhammer 40k army. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out in the link in the video description if you'd be interested in picking one of these up. In general, I've mostly heard pretty good things from people who have got them. It's just one option among many for miniature transport though, and there's plenty of other makers out there. Foam cases or simple boxes can be an option, or making a DIY magnetic case, but I feel like these could be the right choice for a bunch of people. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to some of the most improved units in 40k after the update, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the Warhammer videos coming. Feel free to check out the other bits down in the video description as well. There's links to the channel's affiliate discount retailers if you want to pick up some models and save a bit versus Games Workshop's prices, and the Patreon page if you'd like to help support the videos. There's a few rewards for that, such as seeing videos early from time to time, names in the credits, and entry to the channel giveaways. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.